that make the same grip on the same ship. So we must push one common intention. It's for a better life in the region. For we women and we children. That must be the ambition of the Caribbean and the Caribbean and the Caribbean.
And a very good evening to you, and of course, the voice of the Black Stallion, Dr. Leroy Callis in the background, the ambition of the Caribbean man, and I dare say the Caribbean woman, is to ensure that we have the proper life for our women and our children, starting there, privileging the lives of women and children. It is said that if you look after your women and your children and your old people, it says something about where your society is. And that is why when we look at what they're giving for old age pension, what they're giving for the social the social sector, as they call it, and what they're emphasizing, oh my God, it says something about the humanity. You know, budgets are about how much you spend and where you spend and what you're spending on and all of that. But at the end of the day, it's about human beings. What are you spending this money on, and how it's affecting the quality of life of the human beings? I remember as a small boy growing up, and you're hearing some terms I have mentioned in this program. I was a radio man, as I have said here on many occasions, and I heard Wilfred David. At that time, he was an advisor to the PNC government, and I heard him on the radio. I can't remember who was interviewing him. And I heard him talk about growth and development, that you could have growth without development. And you know, as a little 12, 13-year-old, it didn't make sense in terms of economics, because I knew nothing about economics. But what it did is that it kind of made me think as a boy, because you assumed your little mind as an early high school student that growth automatically leads to development. And so here was this man, in a sense, contradicting that. And, you know, it set the head going. You know, so it's one of those things. And we're going to be talking about growth and development with Professor Clive Thomas today, because who would have thought that 50 odd years later, we would be hearing a lot about growth and development. You know, our government emphasizes the growth in our country. And indeed, there is growth. You all know on this program, we said that we are not denying the growth of the GDP. We are not denying that. There is growth. Whether that growth is translated into development is where the government comes in. Some people think that we have to knock the government about growth. The growth is happening not because of the government. It was because of the windfall that we have had. The oil and gas that came our way a couple of years ago when we didn't expect it. And so the growth is happening because of that. For that growth to translate into development, and by development, we mean development that first and foremost affect the quality of life of our people. That's where the government comes in. And so we want to talk about growth and development, because the government and their supporters tend to conflate the two. As my little mind as a little boy was doing, until I heard Wilfred David. And then later on, as I grew a little bit older, and I was still in school, when I heard Clive Thomas with bread and justice. Oh my God. Oh my God. Oh my God. You know? That was another. So you grew up as a boy in the 70s, as a girl, a little schoolboy, schoolgirl. It was a good time to be a schoolboy and a schoolgirl, a school child in the 1970s, because it was a period of progressive politics, revolutionary politics, all over the world. All over the world, not just in Guyana and the Caribbean. It was a time when Bob Marley burst on the scene with all that revolutionary music. It was a time when Viv Richards and Michael Oldin and Andy Roberts and Clive Lloyd leading that team burst on the scene, where cricket became more than just a game. It was the time of Walter Rodney and Clive Thomas and Rupert Rupnarayan and Daye and further afield, Maurice Bishop and Tim Hecton, George Odlum and Trevor Monroe and all that revolutionary politics. And it was a time when we began to read in school the George Lamins and the Samuel Selvons and Edgar Methalza and Martin Carter, that Shakespeare wasn't the thing. It was a wonderful time to be a schoolboy and a schoolgirl. I think, and I've been talking to my schoolmates, you know, we are all now old men and women, and that the direction our lives took had a lot to do with that ferment of ideas in the 1970s. When our teachers, our English teacher would take us from Buxton, we were in third form and second form, and take us to Theatre Guild to see the plays there and actors of and actresses of the caliber of Ken Cosby and Mark Matthews and Henry Mutu and John Agard. It was a wonderful time. And here we are 50 odd years later. We are grappling with some of those ideas that were planted in our little minds at the time. We are now older and we are dealing. And welcome to Politics 101 on a Wednesday night. Welcome. If you're joining us from Guyana, welcome. Wherever you're joining us from. A special shout out, of course, to the people of Baracara. And they can hear us because they have internet now. And it was 5 years ago under the coalition government that the people of Baracara got internet. I think David Granger would have visited. And, you know, he is a historian. And Baracara is a maroon community. They said it's the only maroon community in Guyana. Research is showing that there were other maroon communities across the country, but Baracara stands out. And Baracara's produced this little boy who's now a big boy because he has put Guyana and the Caribbean again on the cricket map at the time when we are losing. You remember in the early days of our cricket, we became a test playing team in 1928. But between 1928 and 1950, when we beat England in England for the first time, we didn't win much. And there were two players, for the most part, who carried the team. George Headley, still regarded as the greatest West Indian batsman ever, and Larry Constantine. Larry Constantine, his numbers are not as superlative as Headley's, but the role he played, he was our first cricketing superstar. He could bowl fast, he was a dashing fieldsman, and he was a hard swashbuckling batsman. Set the stage, if you were, for a Sobers to come later. And it was Headley and Constantine who carried the team. And so we are accustomed to the team not doing so well, but individuals doing well. It is more a team sport, but it's also a sport where individuals can rise above the rest. And the people of Baracara ought to be proud. And as I've said over and over, is our government taking note that there are places like Baracara, and there's so many Baracaras all over Guyana, that you can develop Baracara. So that instead of one Shema Joseph, you can have several Shema Josephs. And that is what we mean by a government having a vision of where you want to take the society. For as long as I can remember, going back to that same 1970s as a little schoolboy, and we were fortunate in Buxton. Everybody used to pass through there. I remember as a boy seeing Geddes Granger, later became McCandle Dagger, who led the 1970 revolution in Trinidad. I remember seeing him coming through there. I remember seeing Stokely Carmichael coming through there. The Walter Rodneys, the Clive Thomases, they all came through Buxton, and we were fortunate. We were fortunate. Maurice Bishop, I saw him as a boy, came there, you know, to represent Anil Rampasad, and came to Buxton. They all came there. And so as boys and girls, as children, we were lucky to be seeing these people in the flesh, as they said, back then, to seeing them in the flesh. And I tell the story all the time that Walter Rodney came in 1974 or thereabout. And I remember he came there, and Bonita Harris came along with him, and he had this little talk with us. You know, we were barely 14, 15, 13. And, you know, he said that, you know, history is made by ordinary people, not necessarily by leaders. And that someday somebody's going to record that we were sitting in this schoolroom talking about change in Guyana. And I don't know that I heard and understood, that I understood everything that he said, but that one thing that I, as an ordinary little boy from a poor neighbor, I think most of us were barefoot. We were in that meeting barefoot, that we could make history. I ran home and I said to my auntie, Brother UC brought a man named Walter Rodney, and I like what he said, and I want to join the thing. And she said, well, you could join so long as Teacher Sidney. They still took the liberty of calling Quayana Teacher Sidney the big people. And she was a Quayana man, because when Quayana and Burnham broke, she broke with Burnham, and so I didn't have any much problem. She said, once Teacher Sidney, you can join the thing. Hence my association with the WPA started at that young age. But hearing that ordinary people could make history. And of course, I went on in my dissertation, first of all, my master's thesis, and later on my PhD dissertation, to record that meeting. What a wonderful life. It's good to be a Guyanese. It's good to be a West Indian. Our challenges have been enormous, but my God, and a most interesting space. Small islands and mainland states, but complex. At the center of the development of what we know today as capitalism. Eric Williams, in that book, Capitalism, Slavery, making the point that European, British capitalism, really its genesis in the money that they made from sugar and other crops there in our Caribbean, capitalism and slavery. Good evening to all of you who are joining us from inside of Guyana, and those of you who are joining us from outside of Guyana. In our wider Caribbean, those of you who are joining us from North America, Brooklyn, of course, New York, the Queens, the Bronx, etc., Canada. I always forget the people a little bit north, well, not a little bit north, the people in Connecticut, you know, and we have a lot of our people there in Connecticut and Boston. It's nice when you're driving up that way. Good evening to you. And those of you who are joining us from down south, South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, and some of you I know are joining us from Tennessee. We were talking about the Tennessee walls on Friday. You all young people and know them kind of old time music, but mesmerizing music. I was dancing with my darling. The Tennessee Waltz, classic music. Those of you joining us from, let's see here. I notice some of you are joining us from Arizona, of course. I'm not forgetting the Arizonians. Texas in the house. Good evening. And of course, our people in Europe, in England, it's late at night there. And I salute you all for taking the time and making the sacrifice to be with us every night. Welcome to Politics 101. As I said, tonight we're going to be talking about growth and development. You know, we teach here, among other things. We teach. We are a teaching culture. Whatever we do in our politics, we mobilize and we do all the other things, but among other things, we teach. We are teachers. You know, I grew up in Buxton seeing whatever Quiana did. He would leave to go to Georgetown early in the morning, and then at 3, 4 o'clock, he's back in the village to teach. And then when he's finished teaching at 6, 7 o'clock, he may go down back to Georgetown at the WPA office, or the case may be. But teaching is something that is part of our political culture and something that we grew up with. It is no accident that so many of us, former WPA activists, present WPA activists, we teach. And so when we are doing this kind of stuff, it's also teaching. They call it public education. Welcome to Politics 101. I'd like to thank all of you. And we have Dr. Thomas tonight, and we're going to be talking about growth and development. We also have a special guest. We have Dr. Dennis Canterbury, WPA member, longtime WPA member. I think Dennis is from the West Bank. Well, certainly lived that part of West Bank, I think around Sisters Village, but he will tell us. I remember going over there, but you all know that I did a lot of work in that area. Good in 10 Sisters, Wales, starting from Battersville, going right back. Very fertile area and often forgotten. But Dr. Dennis Canterbury, who taught for years at the University of Connecticut, I think I get that right, and he's going to be co-hosting the program with me today. So let's bring in our visitors. Professor Thomas. Professor Thomas, good evening. Dr. Canterbury, good evening.
Good evening, David.
And welcome first time to Politics 101. I know we tried to get you before, but there was some little technical hiccups, and I was amazed today when I came into the studio. You were ready. You said you started half an hour before to make sure that you got it right.
Yes, indeed.
Professor Thomas, welcome again.
Yes, David. Yes.
And as I sometimes take us down memory lane back to you would take us long before the 70s. But you know, my journey as it was, and I think for Dennis too, would have begun in what Valentino the Calypsonian called the roaring 70s. If you may see why, I know you've lived and worked through almost 8 decades, 9 decades, going on to. What is it about the 70s in Guyana and the Caribbean that makes it unique in our journey?
I think it's a matter of serendipity. Just accident of history and time. It's part of what was happening in the entire world. I happen to believe that now we're in a similar period, but the opportunities for taken this forward are very different from those of the 70s. And I'm trying to get people focused on that and accepting that with the windfall gains from oil and petroleum and all that, we can be put in a position where we can see ourselves and see humanity in a more global, or I would say more importantly, a planetary context, and begin to think of the future of existence, life, and the contributions of the human species. Because in the things that we're going to be discussing,
yes,
you already see brought into evaluation of people's developments, like through the United Nations Human Development Index, they're talking about the planetary impact on countries as one of the variables to take into account in measuring the state of development in particular countries around the world. So we are thinking in a transcendental way, far beyond the scope of what. And I think we are in that pivot, and I hope that we can join that civilization because we have the promise of an ability to be able to do that.
Professor Clive Thomas there, introductory comments. Dennis, where exactly are you from? I'm locating you on the West Bank because I remember you there back in the 70s. And then your thoughts on the 1970s.
Well, I think, David, I was born in New Amsterdam in Borby. And I came down to Georgetown. I got married and moved to the West Bank at Good Fortune and did a lot of work over there at Bagottville, organizing a cultural group there and doing a lot of work. And also, I'm not at the University of Connecticut. I was at the Eastern Connecticut State University. It's a part of the Connecticut State University system.
Mm-hmm.
So that is just to set that record straight. The 70s, yes, indeed, those days were the 70s, including meeting people like CLR James, which was very important. Meeting all the names that you described and called earlier, being in back then it was the Black Power movement, as we called it. And of course, having my start as well in Buxton. I remember you in Buxton, but braided hair back in those days.
Yes.
and I did my subjects by A-level at County High School. So we had a good upbringing in Buxton. Remembering Brother EUC teaching us how to calculate percentages, but by looking at the estimates, and so going through some of the estimates for 2024 and calculating some of the percentages, I'm remembering him because I said this is the same kind of exercises that we had to do back then. And then, of course, moving on from there to the University of Guyana and becoming what I call an apprentice to CY, to Professor Thomas for 14 years or thereabout before moving on. So it's like the 70s were a formative period, listening to the debates in when we were forming the WPA. And those debates, those same ideas from the debates are the things that I write about today, as well as those are the ideas that informed how I prepare for my doctoral studies, etc. Things like defining the peasantry. I remember Clive and Walter debating what is a peasantry, whether there is a peasantry in Guyana, and the two sides, right? The argumentation. When we were then we were meeting in Tiger Bay. There's where those debates took place. Some of them, some of the debates at Nassau Hall. I remember
Nassau, yes.
Right? So the 70s were really formative for us. And I'm still sort of, those ideas remain and they wouldn't go away because you continue to grapple to try to understand what growth represents, what development is. And clearly, as you said earlier, David, as well as what CY said earlier, we cannot think in terms of just growth, because I remember working at IDS where I did something called economic development with a lower demand for labor. So they were saying, and this happened especially after the when they introduced the ERP.
1989.
And with the ERP, they said they had economic growth.
Right.
But this was because of the sale of public assets. But at the same time that you had economic growth, you had all these people being laid off from the jobs.
Right.
And people couldn't go back to work because of the problems with respect to the rise in prices, or you couldn't even pay transportation to come to work. So clearly you can have growth, but it doesn't really tell us anything in the lives of the people. We've seen it firsthand.
Yes. And that's what you're talking about at that period, because that was another pivotal period, because it was the end of the Cold War and the introduction of the structural adjustment by the IMF and the World Bank. In those days, the IMF was a bad name organization in our part of the world. And, it was the assault on the public service because they were asking government to reduce their spending. And that led to the reduction. It led to retrenchment, as you and CY would remember the term. And that retrenchment then led to the growth of trading, where women, mostly African Guyanese women, in suitcases were going to other parts of the Caribbean and bringing goods to sell. It's a phenomenon that is not much studied. And I every year there's some young people in Padaji that do an economic conference, and they invite me to speak. And I always try to go back to that period of trading because our young people are interested in entrepreneurship. And sometimes they ask me to map modern entrepreneurship in Guyana. And I always stress that period following the ERP and the introduction of structural adjustment. If you're just joining us, it's Politics 101, our open word edition. We are speaking with Professor Clive Thomas, and my co-host is Professor Dennis Canterbury, a WPA member of long standing, and someone himself who has grappled with some of these issues. CY, let's start as usual with you defining these concepts, growth and development and their relationship.
First of all, I think I'll start by defining them in a traditional way. Economic growth is largely taken to mean the increase in real per capita GDP, the gross domestic product. That's the conventional definition of growth, and that's important. We can't have development without growth, but growth does not lead to development. So the relationship that you have been speaking about, although it appears to be linear, operates in different ways. You can have growth without development, but you can't have development without growth. There has to be an underlying material expansion in the capability of the economy, in the goods and services available to people, for you to be able to sustain anything called development. The definition of development includes that proposition because it talks about the capacity of an economy to maintain the increase in real per capita income, but also to include other abilities or capabilities. A few of them are definitely embraced in the United Nations concept of the Human Development Index. In fact, as I explained to you last week, many people are not aware, but the United Nations has been empowered by the global community to undertake the systematic study and scientific expansion and explanation and determination of what constitutes development and what countries are obligated to do to support their efforts at ending underdevelopment, poverty, and the eradication of all the privations that come with lack of capabilities. In developing that index, they started out on this task back in 1990, and they produce annually a Human Development Index. A study of their annual publications, because they have to do this by a treaty agreement, shows the evolution of the terms. But almost immediately at the start, back in 1990, that's 4 decades or more ago, they saw that you had to include at least variables that dealt with at least 3 considerations. One, in the life expectancy, because a long and healthy life for human beings and the family are preconditions for any form or description of development. Increase in knowledge, that's your ability to understand the environment, the ability to introduce and understand the applications of science, the ability and capabilities to be able to store your historical legacies, to have your deep understanding of why it is that we exist and what is the purpose and contributions we are obligated to providing for the rest of humanity in every part of the world. So that comes into play in terms of knowledge. And then, of course, we have the standard of living, which they focus on GDP would embrace, but that's gotten much wider now because it takes into account other factors like ecology, environment, how it contributes to sectors that are not covered in economic measures, because economic measures, as the UNDP have discovered and have made pretty clear, have traditionally emphasized things that pass through the market, because that's the only way we could put a value on them, because the value of things would vary individually. But the only way we can find a common value is if we take the price, if it is being sold and bought, if it's being bought and sold in the market. So you need a price system. So economics is oriented towards market systems. And the valuation of work is based on price, hoping that the market is the best expression of that real meaning. But it takes us into a lot of areas of philosophy that are very important, because it's highly obvious from what I've said that there can be no single simple measure of development. But also rationally you realize that after a certain point, there's no need to continue dissecting what is the intrinsic value of any value you're using, because you get diminishing returns. You want something that is operational, will give you a guide to how you can proceed, how you can measure, how you can gauge how countries are performing, what are the obligations to the United Nations system, things like that, how you define that, and then you can move on. But it does not mean that you have to get accuracy down to a complete 100%, what any particular concept means or is equal to, because that would be almost impossible. Because you'll argue forever, and it's called the essentialist fallacy, which we know from philosophy, can bury you in eternal debates about concepts. So there's a practical need to apply these concepts and to recognize that even though they are intrinsically not absolutely correct, like in science, the traditional natural science. They're sufficiently correct for us to use it operationally.
Mhm.
Because if you continue to pursue the truth in the sense of their essential intrinsic value, as in natural sciences, we'll be going down a rabbit hole and we won't be able to contribute anything to human existence, because human existence is so complex and so subject to forces that cannot be regulated at a lateral level, that we would spend ourselves debating how many angels can sit on a pinhead. Some philosophers used to do.
Well, see why? See why? Don't you think that this whole shift in the emphasis to growth is associated with as David said earlier, the economic recovery program and the IMF World Bank approach and what we call neoliberalism or the neoliberal approach? Don't you think that this emphasis on growth, um, notwithstanding the point you just made about the two things going together, growth and development, or one being necessary for the other, but the emphasis on growth seemed to have swept this question of development away from like government policy and the way they went about organizing how the country should develop, because it would seem, I don't know if you agree with this, I'm asking, that the growth tend to have swept away all the development projects and the development emphasis that we had in the 1970s and the 1960s. Any thoughts on that?
No, I would say objectively, if you look at the Human Development Report, you see that the project started out as a heavily based measurement of, based on measurements of income. But where it is now, if you look at it today, as it's published for 2023, it involves so many other complex areas of life. That's a very different concept from that was original. And I think this is a global corporate evolution of scholarship. So it is not the product of any one institution or one place. I think once we engaged in a global agenda to try to understand development and the challenges it creates and the problems that it poses and the needs and the requirements for successful development, we embark on a course that is both partly practical and partly theoretical, because the government's got to deliver to countries every day. So we can't separate one from the other. So there's a difference, like, for example, than interplanetary science. It continues, interplanetary science, without our intervention. But economic systems cannot continue without our intervention. So we're supposed to be partly studying what we're doing as we're going forward, and also operating on it and acting on it every single moment of our life and existence. So it takes on a more complex, I believe, method of treatment as a specialist or the science. But I don't want to get too arcane on a popular program.
See, let's fast forward and come to the present, and these concepts of growth and development are very much now part of the popular discourse. And one of the reasons we are doing it is that we want to take that discourse in a direction that does not lie, right? In a direction that remains true to our tradition of political and economic analysis. Why do you think that there is the confusion today between growth and development, in a sense where a lot of people who are fairly well read and certified are conflating growth and development?
I'm not sure that a lot of people are doing it. I mean, we've done a lot in the past.
Some
But
people,
I
some
think
people.
among serious persons who have been studying these things, there's no real confusion because there are two things that we need to understand. One is that the economic concepts that we have considerable drawback, which are acknowledged up front. The second thing is that recognizing those drawbacks, because as a human community, we invest ourselves in trying to remedy them. We have gone a considerable way, but far from a complete way in being able to recognize the drawbacks and to be able to account for them in any practice that we engage in. So those people at the Ministry of Finance or whoever you think it is, they are aware of the distinction between development and growth in the macroeconomy. They will tell you I'm completely confident, without offering them any kudos, that they know the difference between growth in GDP, real GDP per capita, and development. And that is not to flatter them. That is the basic reality of the first week they spend in the university. So it's not as if they don't know the concepts. But a political class will want to appropriate the benefits of whatever comes to them. So the political class will clearly interpret anything that is favorable to them, even though they may not be the cause of it, because we all admit here that the remarkable rise in the GDP of Ghana is due entirely to the windfall discoveries of oil and gas. It has nothing to do with the government of Ghana. They did not initiate or embark on the exploration. The random events that made this possible in 2015 can be traced back in time, and we've been doing this for nearly a century. But we speeded up in the 20 or 30 years before 2015. And pure serendipity has resulted of what I call happenstance in my theoretical work. We've been able to discover a debatable, but still, by all consent, remarkable amount of petroleum resources and or reserves. Because there's a distinction between the two. And from there, we therefore have the capabilities of taking the material life capabilities and operations of our income generating economy to the heights that we could never foresee. So now we are faced with the politics and the economics of how to deal with plenty. And I think it has been symbolically and spectacularly impressed upon people when they had to deal with the fact that the budget was $1 trillion, because the sheer size of the number made them realize that we're not dealing with what was, to me, a number I thought I would never use in relation to Guyana. Because I started out when it was millions, and that was a huge, humongous figure. Then it became billions after the devaluation. And I also began to struggle with that notion. But to hear a budget of $1 trillion, even myself, were grounded in the expansion of these numbers, I had to say it was a very clever way of introducing that reality, because it made its mark. So I give kudos to those who are thinking forward, but it also shows that we have to adjust our perspectives on the politics and economics of the times and to how we deal with plenty. We have to be able to show how we can use the resources better than them because we understand their generation. We understand how they can be used most effectively. So that is where we have to go. That's my belief, rather than to spend our time quibbling as to whether it's 1 trillion or 1.147 trillion.
Yes,
Which
is what many people are doing.
Yeah. And before, go ahead, Dennis.
But you see, why when in supporting the point you're making, dear, because when you look at for example, the fact that yesterday we depended on gold and manganese and gold and bauxite.
Mm.
And now, as the primary earner for these foreign exchange, but now gold and bauxite is going down, has gone down over recent years in terms of
Yeah.
what they're from it. But yet they're spending in the trillions. So that it shows that the production, they're not getting this money from, as Lance Broderson, one of our colleagues at UG, used to say, they're not producing yam and cassava and edos to make this GDP grow at such a rate. It's just a windfall from something that causes it to, from oil, that causes it to go up. And so they're behaving as though it's their management that is the cause of this money, whereas it's just some money coming in.
What do you expect any government in any part of the world to do? Tell me, which government in the world will let a bonanza go by? It must be realistic. That's the challenge we face, because I don't want us to spend all our time trying to poo-poo the achievement.
Right.
You see,
Right.
I think it's a waste of intellectual resources.
Right.
Trying to defeat it is insignificant. The trillion don't mean a trillion.
Right.
I think the focus should be on politically and otherwise.
Yeah.
And how best to use that trillion.
How best to use that trillion. And see why, you know, before you come in, Dennis, just a little observation here. You know, they went back, I understand, about 8 times. I think about 8 times they went back to the National Assembly for supplemental last year, which amounted to about $90 billion more. So in effect, when you add the 700 and something billion to the 90 billion, it took us last year in up to $1.5 trillion that they actually spent. And that's something I want to talk with you, CY, about. When a government comes up, says, look, here's a budget of $1.14 trillion, and then it goes back for all these supplementals, and at the end of the day, end up spending close to $2 trillion, or the case may be. What is that reflective of? And I guess we can talk about that sometime later on. But Dennis, you wanted to come in and I'd ask you why to make a comment.
Yes, I wanted to know, why is it the Ministry of Finance is allocated like almost more than or almost equal to what all the regions combined are allocated? What do they do there, this Ministry of Finance? We know from the structural adjustment program that the Labor Department was displaced and replaced with the Ministry of Finance as the kind of quote unquote power ministry. But by so much, the allocation for Ministry of Finance for Labor is like 1, and the allocation for the Ministry of Finance is like 500. So why this disparity in terms of how they're spending?
Salaries are issued through the Ministry of Finance.
Salaries. So those guys there, it's a nice place to go and work then.
It's the premier public. European plan the thief. The premier financial department of the government of Guyana. It issues the checks almost for every department.
Yeah, right. And so you got to pay yourself a lot of money to issue these checks to these others.
Yeah.
The monthly checks from the department you heading have to be submitted to the Ministry of Finance. They issue the checks to you, and then you may give them to the worker, or they may send them directly, depending on what arrangement you have.
Yeah. See, let me ask you this question, taking off from your previous comments. And it's partly theoretical, but I think it's largely applied and practical. We have the growth in GDP, and so forth. And as you have been saying, the challenge for us, the challenge for any government in our position, is how to translate that growth into development. And so what I want to ask you in a general sense, what are the ingredients that go into that process of translation from growth to development?
That's where the planning and development of the economy comes in, because you want to do that in a sustainable way, first of all. Secondly, that it produces a rate of growth satisfactory enough to represent the best use of the resources that you're applying to it. So, for example, if you're borrowing as part of that process, the debt itself is not the problem. The problem is that when you spend the money you borrow, are you achieving a level of production that can pay back that debt that you incur and still be top profitable? Once you can do that, it's okay to borrow. Firms do it all the time. Governments do it all the time. So the efficiency of the use of the public borrowing, that is the critical concern. But not everybody is attuned to that level of understanding in economics. And some people, because of their historical experiences with debt, because we were once a highly indebted country, as you all know, and it meant that we didn't have foreign exchange reserves and money to buy this and that, and there were shortages and rationing, are very scared when a government makes any attempt to increase indebtedness, because you have at the back of your mind the era in which increased indebtedness led to more poverty, rather than to productive investments yielding better returns for your country. So it's a matter of judgment, therefore, and good planning, scientific planning done by professionals who are professional planners, to ensure that you are getting a return on your borrowed money that is enough to pay back that money and still make the economy grow at a rate better than any other competitive use of that resource. That is the task of governments, principal task of governments, if they get engaged into that borrowing thing. But here, we don't get that far. Because once you hear a government borrowing, you start to get worried. You must get worried, because we know the history of what happens when we borrow too much. But at this point in time, when we borrow against generational resources that are entirely in foreign exchange, so that we do not run the risk of a loss of capabilities to repay the debt if we borrow from overseas, of total capabilities to repay the debt, and we would have in the previous days when we weren't exporting all this oil. So that the borrowing places lesser stress on what we call the macroeconomy, the balance of the overall economy, as would have normally been the case. And we can then resort more to the competitive and efficient use of the borrowed money. But that places a very high premium on the efficiency and the economic efficiency, particularly, that is return in terms of opportunity cost of the investment that you make in with the borrowed money. Now, many people tell me that some of the projects they see the government involved in do not stand up materially to the physical demands and the rigors, let's say a bridge or a road of the environment. And therefore they figure that that type of investment is a waste of money. But if you waste that money and you don't get a productive return for it, then you can't profitably pay back the debt you incurred. So you have to avoid things like that. And that makes the management of the department pretty hard and makes it more of a science or something for professionals to be doing than it is for politicians to be doing. Because politicians are going to look at the near-term returns, the possibilities of getting more people saying, I am glad they said this thing to us was ignored. We need it badly.
So, CY, do you think then that there is a need for a comprehensive development plan that focuses on that merges the two things, the social development as well as the economic development in a comprehensive plan, as distinct from pursuing growth and then showing some money at what they may describe as one
Social
time.
sector. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And see why, if I may add a little addition to that question. We had a development plan in the 1990s. I think it was unveiled in 1998. I know Kenneth King and others. I think you might have been involved in some way with putting together that plan. And I heard a government spokesperson last night making the point that what they are doing, when faced with the question as to whether they have a development plan, he said that what they're doing is implementing the development plan from the 1996, 1998. So I just wanted to throw that in as you answer Dennis's question as to whether a development plan crafted in the 1990s is necessarily a development plan that
can be applicable. It can be applicable 25 years after. I can tell you that a priori. You don't even have to have a discussion or think about it. You have to be updating these plans. The whole purpose of them is to update them so that they are always current and relevant. You can't just go back. You might look at the methodology we employed. Because in the preparation, that's 1992, I think it was still 96 plan.
Yes, 96.
There was the involvement of social sector, civil society. That's how I got involved in it as a representative of civil society. And you have all the sectors involved in preparation of a plan. But by now we need also to move forward to plans where we do more than just aggregate the development thoughts and ideas that we have. The plans which do some sort of, at least a priori, economic assessment, financial analysis of the impact of projects and that type of thing on the plans. And the likelihood of a return. You don't wait until you get deep into the plan. Like, for example, what I suspect might be happening with the gas for sure. And then you're scrambling to find out how you can make it a feasible long term. Because if you do that, you'll end up creating another elephant as we did with the skeleton plant.
Right.
In sugar. Because you have no previous feasibility study. And you therefore have no background and understanding of the issues which are required to make it a profitable enterprise. Because spending money is not enough. You have to spend the money in a way that justifies its existence and the project that you spend it on. That is why, for example, we say we put before a box on proposal a targeted universal basic income, because that will be written into law. It will be governed by regulations of the state, by legislation that the government introduces, and we'll be able to measure and calculate the returns on the investment to ensure that they will make it worthwhile. But when a government can come up and give you $5,000 here and there and tell you, we can't be here, and you believe that, and there's no forward evaluation of that money, and you multiply it by 800 something thousand people, and a lot of money is involved. The money could be going down the drain.
Yeah.
There's no pressure to do anything efficient with the money.
Yeah.
Relying on the person who receives the money to do something efficient. But they don't even have a vision of how they expect to spend it. And the money is so small in relation to their total needs that they may not even take the time to do a sort of household calculation of how best to use this. But when you give a significant universal basic income, you force households to make calculations and where the priorities go. Shall I repair my house? Shall I invest in the children's education? Shall I take this opportunity to get medical attention for the daughter or the son? or something, some life-changing event, you can make those calculations. Can I go to the bank and get a short-term loan because they know I have this coming, and I sign over the payment to you, help you out of a moment of distress. All these things are possible. But a short-term grant, you don't know when it come in.
Yeah, yeah,
You
yeah,
can't run on the road and go to even the pawnbroker and say, "Let me $10,000 because I expect the government announced today they're going to give out 25." They would never lend you.
yeah, yeah. See why, for the benefit of the reporter types in our audience, in response to Dennis's initial question, are we hearing you saying that it is your view and the view of the WPA that there is need for a comprehensive development plan?
Not only have need for one, there need to be a continuous planning. This thing should be updated every year. The budget should fit into a plan. The budget itself is a mini in annual plan. And the annual implementation of a master plan. This old-fashioned way of going and read a budget line for line over the space of how long it took, I guess, 3 hours.
5 hours and more.
5 hours. It's really ridiculous. I mean, you put all the charts and things in a document. That's the first thing, in fact, I read. That gives me my perspective. You put all the charts in a document, which I think would not require more than maybe 7 pages. The minister gives a speech outlining the strategies employed in this thing, which doesn't last more than an hour. Because you can imagine the Prime Minister of England, of Great Britain, or the President of the United States going in the Parliament, or their electoral chamber, and sitting down for 5 hours reading a speech. Incomprehensible. And we continue to do it slavishly.
Yeah.
Just because the governor had to do it. That was his ceremony. But in those days, the budget was a little slim document like this. I had to read all of them for my thesis. Because it went back to the 60s before we had representative government. And the governor would record all these things in speeches. I'm sure he didn't spend time reading every table.
Yeah. Dennis, any follow-up question or comments on what CY said?
Yeah, I was thinking about the structure of you see, with the presentations on the budget, for example, right? And the budget they seem to be using it as a development as their plan. But as CY rightly said, that is really what they should be doing there is using the budget to execute a bigger plan for the entire economy. But I look at some of the structure of going back to this question of debt, and we know that the debt is not the real issue, as Clive, as CY already pointed out. But when you look at who they owe and who they get money from, I was thinking, and this is a question, CY, whether now with the apparent economic realignment that is taking place at the global level, evidenced by the role of non-traditional finance in the Caribbean and in other parts of the world, whether or not the structure of the debt, or we should reorient the debt in a different direction, other than taking most of the money from the traditional Western sources. Whether there should be more, because we know that the BRICS is growing and expanding, and there's a lot of reorientation taking place at the level. Should we in Guyana, in our pursuit of development and even planning for development, should we think of reorienting who we owe towards that direction?
Of course you should. Because if you look carefully, you notice that a lot of the debt is in fact institutional debt. And they put a little asterisk and you have to go down to find out which institution there is. And I think I recommended to the party that they have an emphasis on considering or proposing the government takes a position on BRICS, because I believe that fundamentally we should be involved in promoting multipolarity around the world. So I am in principle in favor of using our new status as a petro state, because this makes us now one of the largest next possible addition to OPEC. So we have a significant role to play in the future of any oil development. And it will only grow over time because we expect to be producing in the next 4 to 5 years at least 1.25 billion barrels of oil per day. So that makes us a big player, a relatively big player, up in the first 10 to 12. So I think we should be using that to exploit possibilities of a strategic role in BRICS, promote multipolarity, use the funds that we are lending, although we borrow, we lending. Because we got deposits in the Federal Reserve System in the United States. That's where we steal our excess money from the oil. Would you believe it? And to think and to see the possibilities of creating a fund that we are able to manage ourselves, but operates within the private sector. Like I explain why I don't include the governments of the Caribbean and the wider Caribbean. Largely because I feel the governments are going to come back to us. They're going to figure the loans are low priority. And they get a lot of social and political pressures to be tolerant on it. But we should get engaged in the commercial possibilities of private businesses in the region and play a constructive role in the evolution of these. I say this because I also have been exposed and to at least enough of seeing the private sector in the rest of the Caribbean. We realize that it has a really considerable capability and full of vigor and enterprise than I would have sitting back here expected. I think where they have gotten the opportunity to take a leadership, Jamaica, Trinidad, and so forth. They have done so, they've done so with some amount of vigor. I happen to know because of the qualities that are sometimes still make of me that they are very entrepreneurial, very development minded, and looking for opportunities to get money to spend it. They're sitting out there wondering why Ghana is allowing this nest egg to evaporate. But of course, they don't want to come in the country and bounty hunters. That's the last thing they want, they appear to be doing. Looking for bounty. But this is a considerable opportunity for us to take the initiative, I think, in promoting development of entrepreneurial class. Because we are not averse to joint ventures in the plan. Our political philosophy is not so private sector restrictive that we won't engage with other private sectors through the government. So we have a chance of promoting this unique area of joint venture activities involving the government, the guidance, enterprise funds coming out of the oil earnings, much as how Qatar and UAE and all these other countries are doing. So I think that's a leadership role that we should be exploiting.
Yeah.
But those require serious discussion.
Yeah. See, right before we go, I have to ask you this pointed political question. I think we are all agreed here, and our audience will agree with us, that the government does not have a vision of where it wants to take, or certainly a progressive vision of where it wants to take the country and how it wants to translate our windfall, our growth into development. But if you look at their budgets and you look at where they're spending the monies, this budget, $238 billion or thereabout, is being spent on infrastructure and roads and so on and so forth. So one can take it that that's where they that's how they see the development trajectory. Is that trajectory advisable?
I can't say without I can't say a priori. But I would have my doubts after what I said.
Right.
About the use of the funds without careful calculation of the network. I'm always suspicious of the lack of wanting to do the hard work before it's spent.
Right. And of course, if we listen to the vice president poo-pooing planning and feasibility studies, one can get a sense from that.
And the greatest dangers always comes from the know-alls.
From the know-how, yes, one can get a sense that this government is kas-kas, to use an old-time term. You know, they approach economic planning in a kas-kas way, you know, and not in a way that inspires.
Back the envelope.
Exactly. Dennis, any final?
So the painful of it. I'm not anxious to get into a long discussion on that.
Right.
I'm disdainful of.
Dennis, any final thoughts or questions of CY?
No final questions or thoughts from me.
Yeah. Well, brothers, I want to thank you all. I want to thank you, CY, as usual, for coming here weekly and to enriching our discussions and really, if we judge by the responses from our audience, really explaining things. And we have quite a diverse audience, the feedback I've been getting. We have in the audience the professor types, and we should not be surprised at that. To the young professionals and to the normal activist type. So we have quite a diverse audience, and they do find this program very, very useful. CY, as usual, thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, David.
And Dennis, we are indeed grateful that you have joined the team, and we hope that this is going to be a regular occurrence. And
let him come and help me out.
We can draw on your enormous experience in these matters. Thank you very much, Professor Dennis Canterbury.
And thank you very much.
And thank you, the audience, for staying with us another day. And of course, you always look forward to these programs. The way in which, in a sense, we have become so literate on some of these issues. It's really amazing. When the history of this period is written, it will show a transformation in the mass political thought on some of these issues that we think are so complex that they're beyond the reach of ordinary people. I think these programs go a long way in terms of building up that reservoir that can be translated into a consciousness of where we are as a society, where we are as a country. And I want to thank you all very much. Tomorrow night, I think we're having Vincent Alexander and Eric Phillips on tomorrow night. And we're going to be talking about race, ethnicity, and development. So looking forward to seeing you all tomorrow night. And as usual, to say that we love you all, because love is a precious, precious commodity.
One race from the same place that make the same trip on the same ship. So we must push one common intention. It's for a better life in the region, for we women and we children. That must be the ambition of the Caribbean and the Caribbean and the Caribbean.